Before the red carpets, before the golden statues, they wore uniforms. They weren't just stars, they were sailors, pilots, soldiers, real-life heroes who put their rising fame on hold to serve something bigger than the spotlight. This is the side of old Hollywood we rarely talk about, the one where legends paused their careers to answer a different kind of call. These are the actors who didn't just play brave characters on screen, they lived it. From studios to boot camps, from sound stages to battlefields, these are the golden age icons who put country before career and came back with more than just medals. They came back with stories too real for the silver screen. James Stewart. Before he became one of the most beloved actors in Hollywood history, Jimmy Stewart was already preparing for a different kind of role. Not in front of a camera, but in the sky. When World War II broke out, Stewart didn't wait for a draft notice. He volunteered, even though he was already a rising star with films like Mr. Smith Goes to Washington under his belt. He joined the U.S. Army Air Corps, trained as a pilot, and rose through the ranks with real skill. No honorary rank, no celebrity shortcut. Stewart flew combat missions over Nazi-occupied Europe, commanding squadrons and earning serious respect from his peers. By the end of the war, he was a brigadier general in the U.S. Air Force Reserve, the highest-ranking actor in American military history. After the war, he returned to the screen, quieter, more grounded, but with a presence that couldn't be faked. Maybe that's why his roles in It's a Wonderful Life and Rear Window feel so deeply human. Because Stewart didn't just play an American hero, he was one. Clark Gable. At the peak of his fame, Clark Gable wasn't just the king of Hollywood. He was untouchable. Gone with the Wind had made him a household name across the globe. Studios were lining up with offers, audiences adored him. He had everything. And yet, when his country went to war, Gable enlisted. After the tragic death of his wife, actress Carole Lombard, who was killed in a plane crash while returning from a war bond tour, Gable made a decision that shocked Hollywood. He joined the U.S. Army Air Forces at the age of 41. This wasn't a publicity stunt. Gable trained as an aerial gunner and flew real combat missions over Europe, often putting himself in danger alongside much younger men. He flew in B-17 bombers, documented missions, and produced training films for recruits. Hitler himself reportedly put a bounty on Gable's head, proof of how iconic and threatening his presence was, even in uniform. When the war ended, Gable returned to Hollywood, older, quieter, changed. But in the eyes of many, he was more than a screen legend. He was a man who had nothing to prove and still showed up to serve. Charles Bronson. Before, he was the quiet, intense face of revenge in films like Death Wish. Charles Bronson was just Charles Buczynski, a coal miner's son from Pennsylvania. Toughened by poverty long before Hollywood came calling. During World War II, Bronson joined the U.S. Army Air Forces, serving as an aerial gunner aboard B-29 bombers in the Pacific Theater. He flew 25 combat missions, earning a Purple Heart for wounds sustained in action. For a man who would later become the face of gritty, no-nonsense justice on screen, his time in the military was more than preparation. It was transformation. Bronson came back from war shaped by experience, quiet by nature, and with eyes that had seen more than most actors ever had. And when he spoke on screen, even in silence, and it meant something. He didn't need to play the tough guy, he was one. Paul Newman. Before he was the blue-eyed rebel of the silver screen, before Cool Hand Luke and the Hustler, Paul Newman was just another young man trying to find his place in the world. He enlisted in the U.S. Navy during World War II, originally training as a pilot, but fate had other plans. His color blindness grounded him, so instead he served as a radio man and rear gunner aboard torpedo bombers in the Pacific. He narrowly avoided combat during the deadly Battle of Okinawa, only because his pilot developed an ear infection that grounded their crew the day before takeoff. Had it not been for that twist of fate, Hollywood may never have had Paul Newman at all. His military service was quiet, humble, just like the man himself. But it shaped his worldview, his work ethic, and maybe even that edge you could always feel behind the charm. He didn't talk much about it later. But Newman, like many of his generation, let his service speak for itself. Lee Marvin. On screen, Lee Marvin was the rough voice, the cold stare, the kind of man who looked like he'd been through hell, because he had. Before he became Hollywood's go-to tough guy, Marvin served in the U.S. Marine Corps during World War II. He fought in the Pacific in one of the bloodiest campaigns of the war, the Battle of Saipan. There, Marvin was shot in the back by machine gun fire and nearly died. He received a Purple Heart and spent months recovering in a naval hospital. Unlike some stars who returned home and slipped easily into fame, Marvin carried the weight of war with him. That pain, that experience, it never left his face. And when he played soldiers, killers, broken men on screen, it wasn't acting. It was memory. Tony Curtis, slick, charming, with movie star looks that lit up the screen. Tony Curtis seemed like the last guy you'd picture on a warship. But before he made Hearts Race and Some Like It Hot, he was just a kid from the Bronx named Bernard Schwartz, and he joined the U.S. Navy at just 17 years old. Curtis served aboard a submarine tender in the Pacific Theater, witnessing firsthand the brutality and tension of war at sea. For a working-class kid with big dreams, the Navy was more than service. It was an escape, it was discipline, and it was the first time he saw what the world really looked like beyond New York City. After the war, he used the GI Bill to study acting, and turned that uniform into a tuxedo, trading in dog tags for box office gold. Tony Curtis didn't boast about his service, he just let the experience shape him, and the charisma take it from there. Henry Fonda. Henry Fonda didn't need to prove anything. By the early 1940s, he was already a leading man, with performances that echoed quiet strength and moral clarity. But when World War II began, Fonda didn't hesitate. He enlisted in the U.S. Navy at 37, saying simply, "I don't want to be in a fake war in a studio." He served as a quartermaster on a destroyer, and later worked in air combat intelligence, earning a Bronze Star for his service. Fonda's roles were always grounded in calm authority, but after the war, they took on something deeper, a kind of lived-in wisdom, a weight behind the eyes. You could feel it in 12 Angry Men. You could hear it in The Grapes of Wrath. He didn't just act like the conscience of a generation, he served like one. Jack Palance. Long before his razor-sharp cheekbones and steel gaze made him a villain of classic Hollywood westerns, Jack Palance had already faced real danger, not in front of a camera but in the skies over Europe. Born Volodymyr Palahniuk, the son of Ukrainian immigrants, he boxed professionally before turning to acting. But when World War II broke out, that path was put on hold. Palance joined the U.S. Army Air Forces and served as a bomber pilot. During a training flight, a serious accident left him with facial injuries that would define his look for the rest of his life. The chiseled, almost haunted face that casting directors later fell in love with. Some say that crash helped craft the iconic Palance stare. Not an act, but a scar. After the war, he studied drama under the GI Bill, and by the early 1950s, Hollywood had found its new villain. But behind every cold-blooded gunslinger he played, there was a real man who had flown missions, faced death, and carried it all into his performances. Palance wasn't acting tough, he just was. Kirk Douglas. Before he became the fierce, defiant face of Spartacus, Kirk Douglas was just Ishur Danielovich, the son of poor Jewish immigrants working odd jobs and scraping by during the Depression. When the United States entered World War II, Douglas didn't wait to be discovered by Hollywood. He joined the U.S. Navy and served as a communications officer on anti-submarine patrols in the Pacific. He wasn't a commander or a war hero in the traditional sense, but he did his job with precision and discipline, logging long hours at sea and rising to the rank of lieutenant junior grade. His military service, while modest in scope, gave him something that would define his on-screen persona for decades: a deep, smoldering intensity, a man of action, but also of thought. After the war, Douglas returned to civilian life with a different kind of ambition. Within a few years, he was starring in films like Champion and Paths of Glory, bringing that same quiet fire to every role. There was always something sharp behind his performances, a man who knew struggle, who didn't take anything for granted. Kirk Douglas didn't play tough guys. He played men with will, and that came from somewhere real. Telly Savalas. Long before the lollipops and the catchphrases, Telly Savalas was a young Greek-American kid from New York with no plans for fame. When World War II broke out, he joined the U.S. Army where he served as a medic. It wasn't glamorous, and it wasn't safe. His unit saw heavy action, and Savalas was eventually wounded in combat, earning a Purple Heart. What's interesting is that Savalas wasn't the typical tough guy soldier. He was thoughtful, observant, qualities that followed him into every performance he gave later. You could see it in his eyes. Even when he played villains or detectives, there was always something more going on under the surface. After the war, he studied psychology and broadcasting, eventually breaking into television. But that military experience never left him. It gave him grit, it gave him presence. And when he stepped on screen, whether in The Dirty Dozen or Kojak, you knew you were watching a man who had seen things most actors only pretend to understand. Telly Savalas didn't just act like he'd been through it, he had. Don Knotts. Most people remember Don Knotts as the jittery, wide-eyed deputy from The Andy Griffith Show. The lovable guy who could barely handle a badge, let alone a weapon. But behind that nervous laugh was a man who had already served his country with quiet courage. During World War II, Knotts enlisted in the U.S. Army and was assigned to a special services unit, not as a soldier on the front lines, but as a performer and morale booster for troops overseas. He toured the Pacific, entertaining soldiers with comedy routines, impressions, and sketches that helped lift spirits in the middle of chaos. But even offstage, Knotts did his duty. He served as a technical assistant and projectionist, helping bring newsreels and information to troops in the field. It may not sound like much compared to combat, but for thousands of young soldiers far from home, Don Knotts was a familiar face that reminded them what they were fighting for. He didn't carry a rifle. He carried the weight of keeping hope alive, and sometimes that takes even more strength. Walter Matthau. Before the grumpy charm of The Odd Couple, before the sharp-tongued wit that made him one of Hollywood's favorite curmudgeons, Walter Matthau was just another young man thrown into the fire of war. He served in the U.S. Army Air Forces during World War II, working as a radio cryptographer in the 8th Air Force in England. It was a role that required focus, secrecy, and absolute precision, decoding and transmitting critical information during air raids over Europe. He also manned anti-aircraft guns, not just sitting behind a desk, but actively defending against enemy bombers during some of the war's most dangerous nights. By the time Matthau returned home, he'd seen enough of war to understand its gravity. He didn't talk much about it, but the quiet intensity he brought to his roles, even the funny ones, always carried that hint of something deeper. There was a reason Matthau could be sarcastic without being cruel. He understood the weight behind the joke, and maybe that's why his humor felt so human. George C. Scott. When George C. Scott stepped into the role of General Patton, he didn't just deliver one of the most commanding performances in film history. He brought with him the ghost of real military experience. Years before the Oscar and the iconic monologue, Scott served in the United States Marine Corps. Enlisting in 1945, just as World War II was winding down, he spent his time as a ceremonial guard at Arlington National Cemetery, standing watch as fallen soldiers were laid to rest. It wasn't combat, but it was service with weight, surrounded by grief, tradition, and the constant reminder of war's cost. Scott originally planned to become a writer, but after the military, the stage came calling. And when it did, he brought with him a gravity that felt earned. His voice thundered, his presence dominated, and there was always something behind the eyes. Not rage, but resolve. Maybe that's why Patton hit as hard as it did. It wasn't just performance, it was memory, form, and respect. Wearing a uniform he once wore for real,